Welcome to the Langley Adams Library in Groveland. We are here tonight with Dan Kennedy, who is a Nashville media commentator. He is a professor at Northeastern University, and he is a panelist on Beat the Press. I just wanted to let you know of a few upcoming programs that we'll be doing in the month of March, which is our Groveland Gathers to Read month. In our book this coming month is going to be 12 Years a Slave, written by Solomon Northup. And the first program that we're going to be having is American Music from the Time of 12 Years a Slave, which will be violin music. They'll talk about the history and chat about antebellum music at that time, and that's Lawrence Young and Suzanne Powers, and that's going to be on Monday, March 3rd at 6:30. And on March 8th, which is a Saturday, we're going to be showing the movie, and that will be here at 10:30 a.m. On March 10th, which is also another Monday, at 6 o'clock, we'll be having Seth Rockman, who's a professor at Brown University. He's going to be coming to do melt hands and field hands. And we will also be having on March 24th a visit with Abraham Lincoln. His name, Steve Wood, will be all dressed up, and he looks remarkably like Abraham.
Do you know that personally?
I have seen the picture. I haven't gotten to meet him.
And you met Abe, so you know.
I know that. I have.
You saw the movie.
I did see the movie. He looks remarkably like
He
Abe.
does.
And we're going to be having another author who's coming from New York, David Fisk, who's written a biography about Solomon Northup. And that he will be coming on March 29th at 11 a.m. And we'll be having several children's programs. Super Sleuths, you might like to come to it. It's on Wednesdays. And now, Dan Kennedy.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming out on a cold Monday night. I really appreciated it. And I figured people love to talk about the news and the news business, so I do want to leave plenty of time for conversation during the course of this program. But I do have a presentation that I wanted to make first. And the whole idea, I want to talk primarily about, not exclusively, but primarily about a book I wrote called The Wired City, which came out in the middle of last year. And it's about new ways of doing local news at a time when the money has disappeared from journalism in many respects, or at least the old models of money have disappeared. And one of the things that I'm actually working off a printout of slides, if I were showing the slides, you would see that it says, journalism is thriving. The business of news is not. How can we fund the information we need for a functioning democracy? So that's essentially what I did with my book. A lot of it takes place in New Haven, which I'll get to, but first I thought I'd do some framing. Now, first of all, why do we need new ways of doing journalism? Why do we need new ways of doing the news? The problem is that the internet broke the connection between advertising and journalism. From the 1830s until about the middle part of the last decade, the news business absolutely thrived because newspapers, later joined by radio and television, were one of the most effective ways for businesses to reach and stay in contact with their customers. And the internet really broke that connection in a pretty dramatic way. And so now we've really been scrambling ever since. In addition to that, civic engagement is really declining in our highly mobile society. And it's very difficult for news organizations, and especially local newspapers, which is a lot of what I'm talking about. Very difficult for local newspapers to get people interested in what they are doing if people fundamentally don't really care about civic life. Newspapers can load up on the astrology column, personal finance advice, gossip, whatever, in an attempt to reach people who don't care about these things. But fundamentally, if you can't get people to care about what the city council's up to, you're not going to make it, because there's always going to be somebody else who can do a better job of covering gossip than your local newspaper. Finally, so what we really have twin challenges. We have the financial challenge, and we also have the challenge of reaching out to what Dan Gilmore, one of the leading thinkers in our field, calls the former audience. And what he means by the former audience is that people no longer have to be passive recipients of the news. They can talk about it among themselves, and they can talk about it with each other. And we need to find a way to engage that former audience in a conversation about the news if we're going to have any chance of success. Now, why don't we talk a little bit about the Boston Globe before I go down to New Haven? Because the Globe is one of those news organizations that really kind of all unites us. We all look at the Globe either every day or at least occasionally, and we have some sense of what has happened to the Globe over the last 10 to 15 years. As you probably know, the New York Times Company, which had bought the paper in 1993, sold it last year for a fraction of what it had paid to John Henry, the principal owner of the Boston Red Sox. As it turns out, he may have gotten it for about the value of the property that it's on. And John Henry said in an interview with Boston Magazine last week, people pretty much knew he was going to do this anyway, but he confirmed he's going to sell the property, move the Globe into much smaller headquarters closer to the downtown, which is certainly a good thing, and then print the paper out in the excerpts somewhere, probably in Millis, where he acquired a printing plant when he did this deal. Like just about all newspapers, the Globe got 80% of its revenue from advertising when it was thriving. Today, it's moving toward more of a 50-50 split. They have taken some steps to try to get people to pay for the paper online, which has traditionally been a pretty tough sell. People pay so much for their computers and their internet connection and everything else that when you then say, oh, and we also want you to pay for the paper, people say, wait a minute, I paid for enough. But the Globe has had some success in getting people to pay for the paper online. They also have had some success in raising the price of the print edition. A lot of people read the paper online these days, but their attitude has been, we're going to keep offering the print edition, and if you want the luxury and convenience of print, by God, you're going to pay for it. And so they've had some success with that as well. Nevertheless, the Globe's future is far from settled. John Henry seems to have hit upon some very interesting ideas for reinventing the paper. But the future of the Globe is online, and charging for online remains a pretty risky proposition, even though they've had some success with it. Now, to just explain a little bit about the golden age that came to an end about 2005, we'll put a year on it, 2005 we'll say. The golden age began with an earlier technological revolution. just as the technological revolution caused by the internet has completely disrupted the newspaper business, the technological revolution of the 1830s, in which hand-powered printing presses gave way to high-speed steam-powered printing presses, and then later electricity and everything else, that was an enormous technological change that literally created the modern newspaper business. And it led to advertising dominance. Before the 1830s, newspapers tended to be, they were very expensive. And so they tended to be sponsored by political parties and political factions. And very few of them were daily. They tended to be maybe weekly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. But all of a sudden it became very possible to print that daily paper, charge a penny for it, it was called the penny press, and get it into the hands of the masses. So instead of having a lot of stories about politics, you had a lot of stories about crime and sensational news of various kinds, because you were reaching a mass audience for the first time. Now, newspapers have actually been going out of business since the 1920s. Cities and towns that had a dozen papers would have half a dozen, and then 3, and then 2. And then in most major cities across the country, for quite a while now, there has been just one newspaper, one big daily newspaper. Boston, you might say, has 1.5. Well, I mean, I don't say that to put down the Herald, but the Herald has gotten to be very small, and it really is no real competitor to the Globe at this point. As recently as 10 or 15 years ago, the Herald did certain types of local news as well as, or better than, the Globe did. But these days it's very tiny and really isn't in a position to compete. Now the funny thing is, a very funny thing happened on the way to all these newspapers going out of business. If you happen to be the owner of the monopoly newspaper, life was better than ever. The business was shrinking overall, but suddenly you had the monopoly. And so the money started rolling in. You'd say, well, what about radio and TV? Well, there were certain types of ads that only newspapers could really deliver on. The classified ads, pages and pages of help wanteds and cars for sale and apartments for rent. I worked for the Boston Phoenix for a lot of years, which sadly went out of business about a year ago. Well, what sustained the Phoenix? Again, pages and pages of we need a roommate. We need a bass player. I want a girlfriend. I mean, that's what a lot of the advertising in the Phoenix was. And that all moved to Craigslist and various free services. And so the Phoenix is no more. A.J. Liebling, the great press critic, once wrote something that was very funny about monopoly newspapers. He said, if you're an owner, there are only 3 kinds of monopoly newspapers: good, better, and bestest. Because you were pretty much guaranteed to make money. So what we really saw when the age of monopoly really came into being in the early 1960s, this is when papers like the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Miami Herald, the Dallas Morning News, and numerous others that you can think of, suddenly became a national force because they were just rolling in dough. And they spent some of it on journalism. And so the Globe became a Pulitzer Prize factory, doing fantastic reporting, not only locally, but nationally and internationally. And we saw that in paper after paper. I remember this fantastic story about the Lowell Sun. The Lowell Sun, not a big paper, where their owner became obsessed with the plight of seals in the Arctic. So he sent a reporter and a photographer to the Arctic. Unimaginable today. But what we tend to lose sight of is that it was also unimaginable before the 1960s. This period when newspapers had more money than they knew what to do with didn't just come to an end in 2005, but it had a limited period of maybe 30 or 40 years. It wasn't forever. Traditionally, the newspaper business was low-paying, disreputable, all those things. And suddenly it became this big business. Now, in addition to the financial aspects that I'm talking about, I mentioned the decline of civic engagement. Robert Putnam, in his famous book, Bowling Alone, talks about people who are involved in civic life by any measure, whether they go to religious services, whether they coach a Little League team, anything you can imagine, they are the people who are also newspaper readers. And so as we've seen a decline in this kind of civic involvement, we have seen a decline in newspaper reading. By the way, Putnam's title, Bowling Alone, pertained to the idea that, our civic ties are loosening. We used to bowl in leagues, now we bowl alone. His title was extremely optimistic because the theme of the book isn't that we were bowling at all, it's that we were home watching TV. And as I said, if the public doesn't care, then journalism is endangered. News organizations must create their own involved publics. So what is to be done? Another one of the big thinkers in our field, a guy named Clay Shirky, has said that no one thing will replace what newspapers used to do. And I'm over-summarizing because, of course, newspapers are still doing a lot of what they used to do, but less of it than they used to, and they continue to shrink. So he says no one thing will replace what newspapers used to do. So he says, what may make up some of that loss? He says many things will replace some of what newspapers used to do. So he says nonprofit media, new forms of for-profit media, and volunteer media. Now, in my book, The Wired City, I do try to look at all three of those, mainly nonprofit, but also new types of for-profit and some volunteer media. Why did I pick New Haven? The pizza, of course. And I would say that the Modern is a little better than Pepe's, but that's neither here nor there. The reason I went to New Haven is that it is the home of one of the great, innovative, nonprofit community news sites in the country, the New Haven Independent. There are a number of these. There's one in San Diego that's excellent. There's one in Minneapolis that's excellent. There are some smaller ones. But of the big, interesting, nonprofit news sites, New Haven was, frankly, the only one that I could drive down to in a couple hours and keep interviewing people and doing my reporting. So I picked New Haven, and in addition to that, I think it had the makings of something that could hold a narrative. The founder and editor, Paul Bass, and his young staff are just absolutely wonderful, and it was a lot of fun telling their stories. Now, when I first started going down to New Haven in 2009, things were actually a lot worse than they are today. The New Haven Register, the big daily down there, was in bankruptcy. I interviewed people at the Register, and it just felt like death. It's like they were waiting for the end. When I say they were bankrupt, their parent company was bankrupt. You had a urban community, mostly African American and Latino, very poor, with very few news options. So what alternatives are there when the marketplace fails? And in New Haven, the marketplace had truly failed. Well, the New Haven Independent was founded in 2005 by Paul Bass, who, like me, came out of alternative weeklies. I was at the Phoenix for many years. He was a legend at the New Haven Advocate for many years. And we both decided to try new careers. I went into academia. Paul, who maybe is more willing to work than I am, decided to start a nonprofit news site. It's small, staff of 4 people. They ride around the city on bikes. They work out of this tiny office in the headquarters of the local Spanish language newspaper. They ride around with cameras and notebooks, and they update the site several times a day, about 5 days a week. Now you'd say 4 people. 4 people, how can 4 people compete with a fairly big paper like the New Haven Register, which to this day has about 80 full-time employees? Well, it's not as hard as you think. You look at those 80 people at the New Haven Register, a lot of people in sports. The Independent does not cover sports. A lot of people covering the suburbs. The Independent, if it happens over the border in Hamden, they're not covering it. Oh, look, there's a fire over the border. It's over the border. We're not going to cover it. It is New Haven only. It is hyper-local. And when you look at how many reporters the New Haven Register has devoted to covering just New Haven news, well, guess what? It's about 4. So they're equal. And the Register has a strong emphasis in its Yale coverage on crime and Yale. These seem to be their 2 major interests. And I'm not putting them down. They actually do a pretty good job of covering those 2 topics. The Independent is really covering quality of life issues in the city. They're in the neighborhoods. They're in the African American neighborhoods. They're covering local politics in a way that the Register isn't doing. And they really do a terrific job. And when I talked about creating your own involved public, they take comments, on news site comments, they take them seriously. I mean, we've all read news site comments and want to go gouge our eyes out as soon as we finish reading them. At the Independent, no comment is posted until somebody's read it and said, okay, this contributes to the kind of civically oriented conversation that we want for the site. And as a result, the comments are among the most interesting parts of the site. And it creates this sense of conversation and civic engagement that I think has really contributed to the success. So what are the strengths of the Independent? They're not reliant on a shrinking ad base. The online-only format means that costs are low. They have a budget of about $450,000. Most of it goes to paying journalists. The 4 full-time people who work for the Independent, including Paul Bass, are not getting rich, but they're not making a sacrifice financially as compared to working for a community newspaper. The salaries are actually comparable. And they all get free health insurance. That's something that Paul Bass has been able to do for his employees. So you see, they're actually making money in that respect. Where does their money come from? It's the public radio model. It's foundation grants, including a lot of local foundation money, which is very important because national foundations tend to give money for 3 years, and then they say, okay, you should be sustainable at this point. And it's a good way to get started, but a lot of times places just hit the wall after 3 years. They said, well, we've been doing our thing. We haven't been out making money. But the Independent gets a lot of local money. They get some institutional sponsorships that look so much like advertising that we might as well call it advertising. But it's like some colleges, the big hospital in town, and they get some donations from readers. But they haven't pushed it that hard. I think they feel that given their readership base, they're not going to get much money out of that. But they do ask people to give money if they can. What are the weaknesses of the Independent? Well, the readership is very small compared to the New Haven Register. The funding for future years is uncertain. although the funding for future years for any newspaper that's reliant upon advertising is uncertain, so maybe that's not that big a deal. And the lack of a print presence does exclude some residents who are less engaged, so that is an issue. And one of the things that I would be very critical of the Independent for, I mention it in the book, but it's become more glaringly obvious over time, is that they have no real mobile strategy. And if you look at studies of where news consumption is going, especially in minority communities, they're skipping broadband and going straight to mobile. And the fact that the Independent doesn't really have a good mobile site, I think, has been kind of a failure. Now, strangely enough, when I began doing my work in New Haven, I figured, well, this is easy. I've got the young upstart news site here. I've got the dying newspaper, and this is a good story of new versus old, and I can sustain it. Well, the Register and its parent company, the Journal Register Company, actually fell into the hands of some very progressive and interesting people. You wouldn't think this would happen, but in fact, it went private. They left the stock market, and they hired as their chief executive a very interesting guy named John Payton, who had made his bones doing some sort of a Spanish language publication in Miami. And they have embraced the model of digital first. Their idea is we're going to think about the internet first, print second. The Register, the editor of the Register, had refused repeated requests for me to interview him. And I figured, well, fine, I'll do it without the editor. I had interviewed the managing editor, which was great, but I wanted the editor, but he wouldn't do it. Just before my final deadline, the editor of the Register was relieved of his duties and replaced with a very young progressive editor who emailed me and said, hey, I hear you're doing a book, let's talk. And you know, my deadline was like days away. I said, well, of course. So I went back to New Haven and I met with the new editor, Matt Dorenzo, and he outlined a very, very interesting vision for reconnecting with the community. He wasn't going to start rehiring staff because those days are over, but he had some very interesting ideas for how to reach out to the community in ways that hadn't been done for years. And they are, in the process, they ended up outsourcing their printing to the Hartford Courant. And they are in the process of getting rid of this horrible building they had, this massive former shirt factory down by I-95, surrounded by barbed wire. And kind of like what John Henry's doing with the Globe, they're going to move into much smaller headquarters in the downtown, where you can connect with people. So it actually turned out to be almost like two good guys, each pursuing a different strategy. Now, as it turned out, the company went through bankruptcy again. There were some legacy costs they had to get off their backs if they had to have any chance of moving forward. One of them was they had to get out of these long-term leases they had for some of these buildings. So they declared bankruptcy for that. Another, sounds a lot more dicey, unfortunately, but they wanted to get out from under some pension obligations. Now that sounds awful, but I'm here to tell you, nobody gets a pension anymore. I don't get a pension, and I work for an extremely benevolent employer. There is no way that company would have promised pensions to people if they knew where the business was headed. So they really did have to get out from under that. People's pensions were guaranteed by the state government, so anybody who had earned a pension was not going to lose it. And I guess they're moving to a 401k type setup, which, for all of the criticism I could offer of that system, is nevertheless what everybody has these days. So They're simply getting in line with where the rest of the economy's going. And though there may be hell to pay one day, they were hardly in a position to be more generous with retirement benefits than the rest of the economy. And they're out of bankruptcy, and they're doing well. They're doing pretty well, and they're among the most closely watched experiments in news that we have today. Now, some other nonprofit media. There's a policy and politics site that covers Connecticut. Big project called the Connecticut Mirror. It's actually more than double the size of the New Haven Independent. They got this big grant. They hired like 10 or 12 people, and they are filling the gap that was created by the decline of the Hartford Courant, which was the big statewide newspaper. There is one full-time employee working for a Connecticut news organization based in Washington. One. She works for the Connecticut Mirror. She does not work for a TV station or a newspaper. She works for this nonprofit news site. In San Diego, as I had mentioned, there's a site that was founded a little bit before the New Haven Independent called Voice of San Diego, which has done a terrific job of establishing itself as a viable alternative to a very shaky metropolitan daily. Used to be called the San Diego Union Tribune. The truly loathsome current owner renamed it UT San Diego. And that would be unforgivable in and of itself, but the way he's managed the newspaper has also left a lot to be desired. And just to remind you that there's nothing particularly exotic about this, there's the big nonprofit news organization that we all rely on every day, probably. Maybe not everybody in this room, but NPR. And this model is not that different from NPR. Now, there are limits to the nonprofit model. As I said, foundations tend to give money for only a few years. The IRS has put a limit on approving nonprofit status for news sites. I think what happened was you go back 8 to 10 years, there were a few applications, New Haven, San Diego, Minneapolis, and the IRS said, oh, sure. And then as the newspaper business really started to decline and people began to see, ooh, this is a great new way of doing journalism, I imagine they were flooded with hundreds of applications. And at that point they said, wait a minute, was this really the educational mission that we saw as being what nonprofit status was for? So there's been kind of a hold put on that. And then finally, nonprofit news organizations can't endorse candidates. And I would argue that although nobody needs a news organization to give them an idea about who to vote for president or governor or senator, there's a lot of local races where I would love some guidance from my local news organization. New Haven has a board of aldermen with 30 people on it in a fairly small city. And the New Haven Independent covers every one of these races like crazy. But unless you can really keep up on it, I would love to know who the New Haven Independent thinks I ought to vote for when I go into the voting booth on election day. And they're legally not allowed to do it. Now, as I said, I gave most of my attention to nonprofit news, especially the New Haven Independent. But there are a few for-profit news sites that I look at as well. One of them is a site called CT News Junkie. And this, like the Connecticut Mirror, covers politics and public policy statewide in Connecticut. The owner, actually co-owner and editor, is a young woman named Christine Stewart. Wonderful, energetic young woman. And it's a smaller operation than the Mirror, but they actually do a very nice job. And she has also done double duty as the Independent's State House reporter. probably the for-profit site that I looked at the most closely in my book, probably second only to New Haven, is a site out in Batavia, New York, called the Batavian. Have any of you ever been to Batavia, New York? Did you enjoy it?
I'm from Rochester.
You're from Rochester,
Yes.
okay. Well, then you know that Batavia is this small, really small
Yes.
city in the middle of a rural Genesee County. And a guy named Howard Owens, who had been the director of digital publishing, pretty much the number 3 person at Gatehouse Media, which, as you may know, owns about 100 newspapers in eastern Massachusetts and about 300 or 400 nationally. He started the Batavian as a demonstration site. He wanted to show what he could do with an online-only, for-profit news site without any newspaper arm to have to worry about. So we started the site. It was going along pretty well, but then Gatehouse said to him, as they have said to many people, "We are eliminating your job." And he said, "Can I take the Batavian with me?" And they said, "Sure, go ahead." And he's made quite a success of it. It's small. It's really pretty much just him and his wife and a part-time ad person. But they've been quite successful in covering Genesee County. They have the kind of vibrant downtown that I think you need to make something work like this. A lot of small businesses. And he has sold them to every funeral home, pizza shop, tattoo parlor, bank, insurance agency, you name it. And he believes in putting all the ads on the front page and rotating them. So if you go to the Batavian, it's thebatavian.com if you're interested. He's got 140 ads on the site, and he's doing pretty well with that. And then finally, there's kind of the original for-profit community news site, BaristaNet, centered around Montclair, New Jersey. I mention it because I did go down there and interview the co-founder, Debbie Gallant. It's interesting. It's not as journalistic as some of these other sites, and so I wasn't really that interested in it, although it is in the book. Now, there are limits to the for-profit model as well. First of all, print advertising remains much more valuable than online advertising. Online advertising is just so ubiquitous that you just can't get that much for it. So if a news organization gives up on the idea of print and says we're going to go online only, the metaphor that people like to use is they're trading print dollars for digital dimes. And it's really print dollars for digital pennies. So you really have to be very lean in the way you approach this. That's why the Batavian is so small. That's why the nonprofits have tended to be more successful in terms of doing good journalism than the for-profits, because they don't have to spend all their time selling a million little ads. Patch has given hyperlocal community news a bad reputation. So you've got that to deal with. A lot of fine journalists have worked for Patch, a lot fewer in the last week or so. I don't know whether they're going to survive under new ownership or not, but I would argue that Patch was always a bad idea. And the reason I say it was a bad idea is that I don't think you can impose a vision from corporate headquarters somewhere and say, we're going to have a community news site and we're going to hire you and you're going to do it. These people work very hard, ridiculously hard. I like what Howard Owens said once. He said, nobody should have to work that hard unless they own the site. And in fact, there's been some very encouraging news in just the last week or two. I've learned that former Patch editors in Jamaica Plain and Newport, Rhode Island, have started their own community news sites in the towns where they got laid off. And the Patches continue in their towns, but I guess there's zombie patches without editors or anything, I don't know. Finally, especially with a for-profit model, there are very few people who have the range of skills needed to handle the journalism, the ad selling, the ad designing. Howard Owens had a unique career that enabled him to do the Batavian. He'd done journalism, he'd done business, he'd done ad sales, he'd done everything. He even knew quite a bit about content management systems. He can talk to you about the glories of Drupal for 20 minutes. Not too many people can do that. And yet, those range of skills are very helpful if you're going to be a 1 or 2 person operation. So what's next? Well, I said that I had also considered the voluntary model. And I closed the book with, and this is something I continue tracking to this day, and this is something in your backyard. I've been tracking something called the Banyan Project, which I don't know whether any of you have heard of it or not. Certainly Mike has heard of it. The Banyan Project was an idea put together by Tom Stites, who is a retired journalist. He's worked for the New York Times, he's worked for the Chicago Tribune. And the idea is to come up with the software tools and the business plan to launch a series of cooperatively owned news sites, news co-ops. It would be like a food co-op. It would be like a credit union. And the idea is that you could become a member of the co-op, maybe by paying a fee, maybe by writing a neighborhood blog, various ways of doing that. Now, voluntary journalism alone is kind of a non-starter. 15 years ago, this was exaggerated. There weren't really too many people who were actually saying this. But there's this perception from about 15 years ago that maybe citizen journalists can do what professional journalists used to do. And to the extent that anybody really believed that, it didn't really pan out. But what the Banyan model would do is you would hire a professional editor. You would hire a professional manager with journalism, who also has some journalistic background. And those people would handle some of the most important coverage and also coordinate the volunteers. This is scheduled to roll out later this year, the first test site right over the river in Haverhill. And the site will be called Haverhill Matters. And the idea is that these news co-ops are targeted at what Tom likes to call news deserts. Kind of like a food desert. It's a place where the existing infrastructure is not providing you with the nutrition that you need. So Haverhill has a corporate-owned daily and a corporate-owned weekly. They're both owned by the same chain, and both of them are...
You only buy it for the obituaries.
I'm sorry, what?
You only buy it for the obituaries.
You only buy it for the obituaries, the Irish sports pages. That's right. And, they still do some good coverage, and they've got some fine journalists working there. But nevertheless, they've been cut back quite a bit. They're not headquartered in Haverhill. And their major owner of the company is the Alabama State Employees Pension Fund. So, the Alabama, the retired school teachers of Alabama, if given the choice between their cost of living increase or an extra reporter in Haverhill, are going to take that cost of living increase, I think. And there's some interesting grassroots media in Haverhill that is involved in Haverhill Matters. They have a wonderful public access operation. They're involved. They have this really interesting online radio station, which some of you may know, WHAV. They're applying for a low-power FM license. So if you live right around Haverhill, you may be able to get it in your car pretty soon. and they're involved. So you've got a lot, and they've got a very active advisory committee. I've been to a few of their meetings. So they've got the infrastructure that's in place, I think, that may bring this to fruition. And we'll see. I really wish them well, and I think it's a very interesting project. I could talk more. As I tell my students, I could always talk more. But I would rather talk with you in whatever time we have left. So thank you for listening to me ramble on, and I would really love to know what's on your mind.
Dan, you're teaching on a baccalaureate level or graduate level?
Mostly undergrads, because our graduate program is tiny, but a little bit of graduate students, and we have big plans for expanding the graduate program.
Do these students, or the average of those students, think they're going to be doing once they get a degree, or do they know they need to go on for the advanced degree?
Well,
Where are they thinking? Because it's certainly...
journalism education is a funny thing. Traditionally, and this is true to this day, half of professional journalists have a journalism degree, which means the other half don't. And, you know, if you have somebody at Harvard who's done a great job at the Crimson, Harvard does not have a journalism program. You're not going to turn her away. But we like to think that a journalism education is a great head start, and it really grounds you in the craft and the ethics of what we do. People who get a master's degree in journalism tend to be people who did something completely different for their undergrad, and they've suddenly developed a passion for journalism. To get a bachelor's degree in journalism and then a master's degree in journalism is very unusual. Now, what we're trying to do now is, and my colleague Jeff Howe has done an amazing job with this, we are unveiling what we're calling a media innovation program in the graduate program. And we are hoping to attract people who have been working in journalism for a few years and know their way around. And they can come to Northeastern and do some sort of a project with web design, with data journalism, with computer science, and at the same time get a master's degree in journalism. We have not done that yet. It's going to roll out for the first time next fall, but we're very excited about that. Yes.
So many questions. What about, the Globe? They say it leans one way. It used to be owned by the New York Times. That leans another way. And then you see other online things that they only take pieces of information, and we see it here in our newspapers. Where do you see those coming from? And I can't even, that's rather the libertarian type stuff that they show up.
Right.
Oh, I only took, this little paragraph out of somebody's whole speech.
Right.
And applies it.
Yeah.
They apply it. That's out there. So when you talk about volunteers, they're missing. There's, I want a real journalist.
Right.
Looking at both sides and not doing the biased. And it used to be, Groveland doesn't have a news, we can't get anything, news.
Yeah.
But you used to go to be at a meeting and
Yeah.
you'd have to read 2 newspapers to figure out actually what happened.
Sure. That's
So where do
always
you see
that's
that?
always been a problem. In the early 1980s, when I was working at the Woburn Daily Times, you had the community was dependent on a 23-year-old who, the first time I covered a meeting in Winchester, I had to go to the secretary of the Board of Selectmen afterwards and ask her for directions to the newspaper where I was going to go to type my story. So, it's never been ideal. There's always been problems. Inexperienced people who don't know the community. It's not like 50 years ago when people would make a career out of working for their local newspaper. And I really wish that would come back, but those days are probably gone.
But even at the national level, you're seeing there's some really wacky things out there.
Oh, sure, there's
At the
absolutely
national
wacky
level.
things, but at the okay, let's talk about the national level for a moment. Sure, plenty of wacky things. Nevertheless, it's never been easier to access all kinds of really quality news nationally or internationally than there is today. I mean, when I was, I'll give you an example that we can all relate to. You know, 20 years ago, the Sunday Globe would show up on your doorstep and you'd need 3 people to carry it in because of all the classifieds. And they had their own reporters nationally and internationally. And you'd say, well, you know, this is pretty good. The New York Times is probably better. The Washington Post is probably better. Probably the Wall Street Journal does some things better. But guess what? I really can't get those. I certainly can't get the Washington Post. So I'll take this, and it's good, and so, you know, there you go. Now you look at the Globe today, and of course, I do think they've maintained their standards for local and regional news, but there's very little beyond that other than wires. But we have so many other things that are instantly available to us. I mean, we all know that, right? And there are great quality sources of news that sometimes we take for granted and we never think to check them out. The Christian Science Monitor, right down the street from Northeastern, is online only now, and it's free. It's wonderful. That is a great source of serious, unbiased news. And that's just one example out of many that we could come up with. Now, you mentioned the volunteer problem. It's a very interesting challenge, and at least as it pertains to Haverhill Matters, I think one of the biggest challenges that the 2 professional journalists are going to have, and I don't know, they may launch with one and then hope they get the money later. I'm just reading your mind. That's going to be one of the big challenges, is managing the volunteer contributors. But in all likelihood, the volunteer contributors are not going to be the people going to the school committee meeting and covering, you know, a big meeting about school closings. They're not going to be covering the city council when they're debating a tax hike. That's going to be the professionals. I think, and this is what I've heard I mean, Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've heard at these advisory committee meetings is that the volunteers will be doing more of what you might expect a volunteer to do, which is, you know, writing about their neighborhood, goings-on in their neighborhood. Some of us are old enough, I am certainly old enough, to remember I grew up in Middleborough, down near the Cape, and we got the Brockton Enterprise. And they had a number of, and not to sound sexist, but this was the 1960s, they had a number of housewives who were like town correspondents, who would write columns for the Enterprise, and it was just, you know, it was just basically social news. They were paid a little bit. That's not the vision for Haverhill Matters. Rather, they will be part of the co-op. But in listening to people talk about this, it sounds to me like the goal is that that's the kind of thing that the volunteers would be doing. Or a volunteer might, you know, there might be a car accident in the neighborhood and somebody gets a picture of it and, you know, it goes up onto the site. And you've also got people who are already involved in doing a lot of different kinds of media for the public access operation, and I think some of that's going to make its way onto the site. So yeah, the volunteer thing is difficult, but there are always challenges, and it's a challenge to be worked out. So we'll see how it goes. Yes, Mike.
Dan, part of the status quo around here is that most of the news is written by people who live 2 or 3 towns away.
You're lucky.
Well,
They're not coming up from the South Shore somewhere.
okay, and you know, and I've had some funny stories related to that. But question is, so Howard Owens, I imagine, lives in Batavia.
Yes.
How about the people at the Independent?
The 4 full-timers all live in New Haven.
Could
But
it
they're
be
not,
that
but they're
that's-
not, but only Paul is from New Haven. And he's only been from New Haven since he
Okay.
was 18 and came to Yale.
I was just wondering if that's part of the formula for success.
I think being rooted in the community is incredibly important. But then you have to consider that with community journalism in a lot of cases, I mean, Patch tried this. If you want to go way, way back, Bill Wasserman tried this with North Shore Weeklies. And that is, he would tell young reporters who were not being paid very well, you have to live in the community. Oh, that sounds reasonable. Okay. Oh, and the community's Marblehead. What?
Oh,
How am I going to live in Marblehead on what you're paying me?
yeah.
You know, and I mean, this happened with Patch a lot too. So that becomes a challenge. But I do think that being rooted in the community is absolutely crucial. But, you know, if we go with this model that we've all become used to of hiring young reporters and not paying them very much, you can hardly ask them to live in a high-priced community.
Yeah, Batavia's not high priced.
I'm sorry,
I
what?
said Batavia's not high priced.
No, it isn't. And it's just him and his wife. It's just him and his wife. Yes.
I saw last week's Beat the Press, and you were talking about the FCC.
Yes.
And I'm ignorant about all this stuff. What is that about? Totally didn't understand it.
This is really, really complicated, and even better, it's boring. But let me try to give the nickel version of this. The FCC, as part of a series of studies, decided that they wanted to study the media ecosystem in, and I think that they picked Columbia, South Carolina, and they thought we'll just study a city and see what's going on here. And some of the questions that they wanted to ask, and what they wanted to do was go into newspapers, go into television stations, go into radio stations. Of course, the FCC has absolutely no jurisdiction over newspapers, but like any researcher, you call them up and ask if you can come in and interview people. They do have jurisdiction over TV and radio stations, so that it's a little harder to say no when the FCC is calling on your TV or radio station. And some of the questions did strike some people as being potentially problematic. How much coverage of the environment do you do? How much coverage of, I don't know, communities of color do you do? And this somehow got conflated by some critics on the right as Obama wants to take over the news business. And as I understand it, the FCC canceled the study. They didn't want to take the heat, and so it's off. But what's interesting about this is it actually was intended as a follow-up to a study that they did in 2011 on local information needs. And it's a very valuable study. I actually made use of it in my book. And it would be overseen by the same person, a journalist named Stephen Waldman, very well respected. He founded a website years ago called BeliefNet about religion. And this really just seemed about as harmless as you could imagine. But like so many of these things, it got sucked into the partisan vortex, and the study has now been canceled. And by the way, I think some of the questions might have been ill-considered, but you know, they were still designing the study. You can always change the questions.
We're pretty much going to have to wrap it up, but I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about your other book.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I did not necessarily come here with the idea that I was going to sell out, but I did want to make a few books available if you were interested. And in addition to The Wired City, I have a few copies of my first book, which is called Little People, and it is partly about raising our daughter who has dwarfism, and but a lot of it is also about science, genetics, history, culture, and that was really a fun book to do, and I figured I'd bring in a few of those in case you were interested.
I just started reading it and it's wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's very nice of you. I appreciate it.
I have a question about that, and I haven't read the book, so maybe it answers it. I don't know. But
Okay.
I was flipping through and one of the pictures in the middle, and I am a firm believer that any nonfiction book should have pictures because you can always find something to.
They wouldn't let me put pictures in the Wired City. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
So
I
the-
just lost some sales.
No, that's okay. So this is my question relating to the portrait of the Queen, who has a little dwarf companion, and
Yes.
you say that he was presented as a gift,
Yes.
a birthday present, and he popped out of a pie.
Yes.
So I have a couple questions. One, I have heard, the story of, the nursery rhyme, how the blackbirds, they actually did come out of a pie. You bake the pie, so they were only stunned. So were they baking actual pies with people in them? How big an oven do you need to bake a pie that fits a dwarf? Was he stunned? And when I Googled it, I found that there were several heads of state that were given dwarves as gifts.
Yes. Well, the person, and I'm forgetting the name of the person, but I can tell you that he lived a very long and fascinating life, so they weren't baking him.
Okay.
Um,
He wasn't just stunned.
They
Papa.
added, I guess they added him to the pie, and
Okay.
I don't know how that was done. But yeah, I mean, dwarfs had a very interesting position in the royal courts of Europe, and Velázquez in particular did some wonderful paintings, and it's funny. We were flipping around to Channel 2 just the other night. And I don't know her name, but that nun, the art person.
Sister Wendy.
Okay, Sister Wendy, that's it. Sister Wendy. Okay, sorry, Sister Wendy. She was looking at this famous Velázquez painting that has a lot of people in it. And one of them is somebody with achondroplastic dwarfism, which is the same condition that my daughter has. It's the most common type of dwarfism. And what was interesting about Velázquez is that he did a number of paintings that had dwarfs in them, and it was very clear from the way he painted them that he was more interested in them than he was in the main subject. He more detail, they captured his imagination in a way that the children of the king did not capture his imagination. So that was kind of interesting. Yes.
Does the Independent, since they're focusing on the diverse population in New Haven, do they also cover, instead of English language, do they also do multiple language?
Great question. I said without following up that they share offices with the local Spanish language newspaper, La Voz de Hispania de Connecticut. La Voz Hispania de Connecticut, that's it. They just call it La Voz. What they do is they pretty much let the Spanish language newspaper handle the Spanish language part of the Latino community. And once a week, La Voz will translate one article from the Independent, and the Independent will translate one article from La Voz, and so there's a little bit of mixing that way. Obviously, a lot of Latinos in New Haven speak and read English, so the Independent is serving that population. But Paul Bass has talked for a long time about finding ways to work more closely with La Voz. At one time he tried to get a grant that essentially would have created a combined newsroom. Didn't get the grant, so they didn't do the combined newsroom. But I would say that the Independent is a lot better at covering the African American community than they are at covering the Latino community. And I say that, though, oddly enough, all 4 full-time people are white, which I think has been another, they do a very good job of it, but I think it's a shortcoming. And I think that the time has long since come for them to have an African American staff reporter, but they just haven't done that to date. And it's such a tiny staff.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess we're good.